Welcome back to our next unit. It's going to be on the Cold War. Notice that we have skipped over a lot of time. If you're looking at the dates there, 1947 to 1991, from our last unit, which was the French Revolution, or Age of Enlightenment and Revolution. The last thing we talked about was the French Revolution and Napoleon. Now, that's way back in the early 1800s when that ended off. Essentially, like almost 150 years have passed between essentially the last lesson or unit we did and this one. The reason why I decided to do this is, well, just a time crunch, especially with COVID-19. The circumstances have come up. The time crunch we have, we only have basically a week left of school here, and I don't want to overwhelm you guys. I've definitely been seeing a lot of reports and getting a lot of feedback on people that are feeling a bit overwhelmed, and I basically had to look at, okay, I'm keeping on track with what's consistent, about a few lessons each week, a unit to 2 units a week, or basically a unit a week or a unit every 2 weeks. In this case, I'm going to put 2 short units into 1 week, and one is going to be on the Cold War. The other one's going to be on modern China. Again, more on modern China later because that'll be a whole other unit. And although it is a bit of a travesty, like from a history mindset, like a great sin not to cover the World Wars era before you go into the Cold War, yet that's what we're doing. I apologize. But I'm justifying that in the idea that if you want to know more about the World Wars, I have put a lot of video lessons up on the YouTube channel for my U.S. Wars class that talks all about the World Wars era. And you can get a lot there. And so that would be on your own time, though. I'm not going to hold your feet to the fire in learning all of that. That would be up to you. I also, part of my justification is that you should have learned about the World Wars era in your U.S. history classes as well, which you should have already taken before this class. So that's kind of the justification there. It's not good, I know. In my own mind, it's not good, but I'm being practical. I'm trying to be as practical as I can. Anyways, without going more into the explanation why we're skipping over some of that stuff and going straight into the Cold War, well, let's get into the Cold War. The reason why I want to go into Cold War is it definitely helps you see the world we're living in today and your place in the world today, and especially your place as an American citizen. Why America has a lot of thought processes and the way we are today, as well as why the world is the way it is today in many circumstances. You need to have an understanding of the Cold War, not just from a United States perspective, also from understanding other points of view as well around the world and other things that happened. So, because I know you have this in U.S. history as well, but again, from more of a U.S. history focused way. Look at that a little bit here, yes. But I'll definitely be giving you more. So first off, starting with, you could say, the other side of the Cold War. Basically, the Cold War is put between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Now, I only have the Warsaw Pact put up there at the moment. Those are the countries in. That's all the countries there are. It doesn't seem like a ton. Although the Soviet Union is massive and very powerful. They're the leading nation of the Warsaw Pact. And really, when we talk about the Cold War, we're really talking about the Soviet Union versus the United States. Now, again, it's technically NATO versus Warsaw Pact, but the United States is the big superpower of NATO, and Soviet Union is the big superpower of the Warsaw Pact. And what they do, everybody else kind of follows along with. So, now this next one I put up here is West Germany. I do that on purpose in the idea of seeing that, separating that out a little bit, so you can see East Germany on as part of the Warsaw Pact and West Germany as part of NATO. I grew up with that split, the idea that West Germany, East Germany were split and we're not one nation. Today they're one nation. It's just Germany today. But I remember growing up. I remember being a kid, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, thinking that I'll never know what happens in East Germany. It's impossible for me to go over there. It's too scary over there. It's like a big black hole, even in my own mind. We didn't have communications, internet, stuff like that back then. So, the fact that Germany is one whole nation today and that feels normal, and I think back to the way I thought as a kid, and it's a bit surreal. But just wanted to point that out because we're going to be focusing a lot on the aspect of Germany and how Germany plays into the Cold War. There's a lot of things that happen there, basically. Now, I could list them all, and I apologize for not, but keeping it simple, pretty much all Central and South American countries. Not all of them, but most all of them are part of NATO. So if you're looking at this, it definitely looks like NATO is much larger. And if we look at a map, Yeah, yeah. As far as covering the globe, NATO, everything in blue, essentially is much, much larger and geographically positioned. If you kind of think about it, NATO has a ton of countries surrounding the Warsaw Pact or the Soviet Union, whereas they don't really have anybody next to the United States itself. And we always kind of took comfort in that. I'll be talking about that later, especially when we get into the nuclear arms race. But the Soviet Union always felt really crunched in because of that, that they felt always surrounded. But I'm really, by the way, what I'm talking about right now, I'm just talking about the red versus the blue, Soviet Union Warsaw Pact versus United States NATO. Notice there's a bunch of yellow countries, just to kind of point them out here. You have China, Mongolia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia and Laos, Yugoslavia, Albania, and Cuba. And Cuba, yeah, is right next to the United States. And of course, from U.S. history, you should remember stories there, which I will be covering briefly here as well. Things like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah, but they were not technically part. Those communist countries are technically not part of the Warsaw Pact. And in fact, when it came to China and the Soviet Union, they actually got along pretty well in the beginning, and that really scared the Western nations, the NATO nations. But then it turned out that they disagreed on a lot of things, and there was actually a lot of ethnic hatred there as well, and they just didn't get along, and it almost turned into a three-ring circus there. Or not almost, it pretty much did. Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact, United States, NATO, and China. It's just on its own, just a massive nation. That can be kind of like the third wheel in a way in this massive fight. And that was actually a blessing to the NATO that China did not get along with the Soviet Union. Things could have been very different in the Cold War if that were so. Now, but again, just there's the map for you. That's the Cold World world. All the nations that are not in blue or red, well, that's because they weren't officially there. There was not a country in the world that was not influenced at least one way or the other. Now, not everybody joined one side or the other, but every single country was influenced one way or the other. If you wanted, we could like put each one of those countries in like little shades of blue and red, or like leaning one way or the other, and which side they kind of went with more. And it was a big battle, a big kind of intelligence battle and diplomatic, political battle and espionage battle for 50 years, being waged behind the scenes to kind of sway one country to the other, to get a friendly government in place towards you and not the other side. Anyways, I'm rambling a little bit, I apologize, but I'm trying to give you an explanation of the Cold World War at the time, and I'm hoping you're taking that and putting it in perspective of what you've already learned. Now, why did the Cold War start? This is definitely getting the notes here. So, just kind of go down the list. At the end of World War II, and that picture there is of Winston Churchill, President Harry S. Truman, and Joseph Stalin, the three main Allied leaders at the end of World War II. Now, they're all shaking hands there, but they do not like each other. Truman and Churchill got along quite well, but those two did not like Stalin. And there was a lot of tension there. Like, you're seeing smiles there, yes, but there's a ton of tension there between those three. But they're at least happy that, the Nazis are beat, the Japanese are beat, the world is finally at the end of this terrible war that's cost more lives than any other war in world history. But there were some issues right there. Is like, okay, what do we do? And the first question was what to do with Germany. They would not agree on that. And we'll get to that one later. But the first thing is they disagreed on how to treat Germany at the end of World War II. Number 2 on the list, growing Soviet nervousness. I actually explained that in the last slide. This idea that the Soviets feel like the West is out to get them. When I say the West, mainly NATO nations like United States, Great Britain, and France. That, maybe the enemies of Japan and Germany are out there, but Joseph Stalin rightly believed that the Western nations also viewed him as kind of a world threat. Yeah. Anyways, I'm trying not to put my bias too much in there. Although I guess I just did a little bit. I apologize. I guess I'll just say it right. I'm not a big fan of Joseph Stalin. That's for sure. He's at the top of my list of like worst people ever in world history. So just get that one out of the way. You can make your own decisions on that one. But he was rightfully concerned that he would kind of get the short end of the stick when it came into things. which goes into number 3, Soviet ambitions versus U.S. ambitions, meaning that number 3 and number 4 actually go together a bit. We see ambitions like the Soviet Union had a desire to want the world a certain way and to see certain things done. The United States had a way of wanting the world to be a certain way as well, and they did not agree in any way, shape, or form, which brings us into item number 4. What did this viewpoint of the world look like? How did you want to remake the world, I guess you could say? How did you want to look at that? How did you want a world that was more peaceful and secure and better off for everyone? Well, it's listed there. First off, socialism versus capitalism. That's the crux of most of it. Everything else kind of goes into both of those. And notice I've color-coded as well. Kind of the red all goes together and the blue all goes together for each side. But the Soviet Union, socialist, Soviet Union, we say that the acronym is USSR. The official name is Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. That's the name. And the original idea of Lenin, the founder of the USSR, the Soviet Union, it's like we're going to turn this into a socialist state so we can get a communist utopia later on. A communist nation or a wannabe communist nation, basically. Capitalism, we've talked about this in other lessons as well. Since we went over the Enlightenment, we talked about this a little bit. I'm not going to explain this too much, but free market, the idea of you can choose, you can be in control of your own destiny. Total government, so leads us to the next part, total government control versus limited government. From the United States perspective and most all of its allies, especially nations like France and Great Britain, government should not have total control. It shouldn't be a monarchy, shouldn't be a dictatorship, shouldn't be totalitarian. Government should be limited. It should have checks and balances in order to protect, the next part, individual freedoms. That's from the U.S. perspective. Going back to the Soviet perspective, I'm sorry, I'm bouncing around a little bit. Going back to the Soviet perspective, socialism is all about the many, providing for all, which, yes, does sound good and you could also argue is a very good goal. But in order to do that, socialism says that you cannot have any individual liberty. So you must, in a socialistic state, you have to sacrifice your personal wants and needs and your personal liberties, things you think you should have choice over, in return for the state telling you what to do so everybody can be happy. And that's the viewpoint of the Soviet Union. And if you can tell, there's no compromise there. Those two sides do not get along. That's oil and water. You'll never get that to mix. Those ideologies, the idea of free market, limited government, individual freedom, a country based off those ideas versus a country that's all about total control, taking care of everybody. The needs of the many outweigh the few, and therefore the few just don't matter. So I know I'm explaining right there, but that's the crux. That's where the emotions come in. That's where everybody just got so, we don't like your side, we hate you guys type thing. We will never live in a world like yours. And we still hear that type of stuff today. Now, into number 5, beginning of the Cold War, and really the reason what kept the Cold War cold is the introduction of the nuclear age, nuclear weapons, and the realization of both sides that we don't want to use these. Meaning that we have them, but if we use them, well then NATO and the U.S. we won't see the fruition of the type of world we want to see. In the Soviet Union, well, they won't see the world that they want to see if everybody's just dead. So it was a big reason not to use them. Anyways, I'll get into more of that later, but those are 5 reasons for the beginning of what is called the Cold War. Now, going in from the Soviet viewpoint, and again, we usually don't get this in U.S. history classes. The Soviet Union, even during World War II, knew that it needed to spread its ideals far and wide as best as possible in order to kind of get their communistic utopia around the entire world. And hey, what better chance when we liberate countries like Poland, when we liberate countries like Czechoslovakia, when we liberate countries like Bulgaria and Romania, well, we'll make sure that pro-communist governments are put in place, and if they get out of line, we'll just replace them. We'll use a heavy hand against them. And so in a way, like in most of these cases, a lot of these countries are just kind of forced to be in this Warsaw Pact or forced to be communist. Or were, I don't know if the word's tricked. It's definitely a biased word. there were some shenanigans going on, and a country where there's definitely shenanigans going on more than anything else was actually Czechoslovakia. In the case of going communist and what the Soviet Union did to kind of twist that one. So, but moving on. Once this happens, though, this whole area right here, again, is pretty much areas that were liberated by the Soviet Union in World War II, whereas the areas over here is the areas that were liberated by the Great Britain and the United States in World War II. And this line just develops down the middle. Now, there was no like official line in the beginning, but that's what it becomes. And this line over time is labeled by Winston Churchill in 1947 as the Iron Curtain. And when Winston Churchill gives this speech of the Iron Curtain, a lot of times that's viewed as the beginning of the Cold War. When Winston Churchill just basically comes out and says, we're this side, they're that side. It's like the big Iron Curtain is in between us. That's figurative. That's not literal. There isn't like a literal Iron Curtain right there. But we just can't see into the other side very well. And again, it's that type of talk that made me feel like as a kid, like I'll never see what's over there. It felt like a black hole because that's the imagery that the Iron Curtain gives. And it really was that way. I just talked to anybody from back in that time period. So there's a few, like my grandpa and grandma, that would travel in there as much as possible. My grandma, she has some stories of being freaked out of her mind, especially when they went to Hungary in the I think it was the 1960s or early 1970s. Anyways, so you could still go over there. Basically what I'm saying is you could still go over there, but it felt like a completely different, and just not unified. Not the way we feel today. We're like, hey, Hungary, I want to go on a vacation there. I can do that. I have the freedom to do that. That was not the case back then. So, one more thing, by the way. I haven't had time to go over this PowerPoint and try to make it better for these video lessons, with notes you can take off of it. So you're going to have to take your notes off of what I'm saying. I should have said that in the beginning. Sorry. But this is one of those things. You need to have the Iron Curtain down in your notes, definitely. But you're going to have to take those notes, just summarize them as best you can off of what I'm saying. Now, after this Iron Curtain is kind of laid over Europe, both sides start digging in their heels. And from the NATO perspective, especially with the United States leading NATO, President Truman comes out with what's called the Truman Doctrine. This is something you should have learned in U.S. history, but I do need to mention it here. Basically, this idea that we need to stop what is called the domino effect of communism. If we let one state fall to communism, then all others will fall as well. We saw the beginnings of that with things like Czechoslovakia, and we just didn't want it to happen. So we promised aid to any country, military, even up to military aid, but definitely economic, to any country that saw any type of communist revolution brewing. We would actively work against it. There's a lot of, how did I put this? Let's just put it this way. The United States is not isolationist anymore when we get to the Truman Doctrine. We do not go back to a system of isolation like we were before the World Wars. Now, where do we see the Truman Doctrine exercised first? In two countries, Greece and Turkey, both right next to each other. But it looked like Greece might be falling to communistic rebels, rebel groups that were sprouting up all over. This map kind of shows where you have major activity of the communists. Communists and socialists, and the United States worked to help the current Greek government put that down, and it worked. I put it down, and Greece basically became a friend and ally of NATO. And then it happened in Turkey as well, and we the United States, we helped out there as well, and put down the communist rising, the Reds rising thing there as well. And to this day, Turkey has been a good friend of the United States because of that, because they essentially had the same government since that time period. Now, getting into Germany, I said we'd get here. This is probably the last thing that we'll deal with for this part of the unit lesson. But at the end of World War II, the city of Berlin was divided into 4 sections. You see the sections there. One was controlled by the French, the United States, British, and the Soviet Union. Soviet Union obviously gets the larger portion there. They're actually the ones that conquered the city of Berlin. They're the ones. The Battle of Berlin was, to put it lightly, a really ugly, messy battle as battles go. Like, it's bad. The stuff that happens is just bad. Again, you'll have to look that up on your own. But basically saying this is one devastated city. And, and these allies come in to help not just cordon off and say this is our area, but say, okay, this is our area and this is how we're going to help this area get back on its feet. Now, the Allies decide after a while, it's like, this isn't working keeping us together, so they actually combine all three together. So the French, the British, and the American side all combines together to be called West Berlin. The Soviet Union wouldn't do that. Like, nope, we're not giving up. And so you got that split right there. Well, the same thing happens in all of Germany itself. So there's Berlin right there, and you need to, like, so many people do not understand this. The idea that you have Berlin right here that's split into 4 different areas between the 4 allies, France, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. But then you also have all of Germany split into 4 areas. The United States section, the French section, the British section, and the Soviet section. But Berlin itself is in the middle of the Soviet section. If you're kind of getting the idea, those allies are having tensions against each other. There's a hot button issue for you. What do you do with Berlin? The Soviets don't want the Allies there. They don't feel like they deserve to be there. But the Allies aren't going to back out. They're like, no, we're not letting you have control of that city. So the big 3 decide to meet about it. Again, another picture of Churchill, Truman, and Stalin. I'm not going to. I usually go into this a little bit more in class, but I'm not going to go into it a bunch right now. Just know they talk about it, and I show this picture on purpose because you can tell they're not really happy. They don't really come to. They realize that there's going to be some tensions going into this. So after a while, though, again, the Allies decide to not just unify Berlin in the idea of having West Berlin versus East Berlin, but they also unify all of the Allied states, the French, the American, and British sections of West Germany West Germany into West Germany. Those 3, and they tried to talk the Soviet Union saying, hey, just give it back to the Germans. We learned from World War I that if we treat our conquered enemies better, things will end up better. And the Soviets are like, no, we're not giving up. But the reason why the Soviets won't give it up is that nervousness we talked about earlier. Like, they don't, once they have something, they're not willing to give it up because they feel like they're giving up power, which, yeah, they would be. And at the same time, they're like, no, any part we're taking over, we're going to make sure it becomes communist, which they do with East Germany. East Germany becomes a socialistic, communistic state. If you guys have ever heard of the Stasi before, I'm wanting to go into that one, but I feel like it's a bit too much to go into this lesson for a basics. But Stasi, yeah, bad stuff. The East German secret police, by the way. So now Stalin decides, I'm going to cut it off. So he cuts off all land routes into Berlin, trying to starve the Allies out of there. This could have been the beginning of World War III. Of course, no one wants to see World War III happening so quickly after the end of World War II. So at this time, now we have who was the president at this point? Eisenhower? I just forgot my history a little bit. I'm so sorry. Eisenhower or Kennedy. I'm pretty sure it's Eisenhower, though. Orders what's called the Berlin Airlift, where just around the clock planes fly in millions of tons of goods to keep the citizens of West Germany going. And that picture you see off to the right kind of says it all. You have this destroyed city and these kids looking up these planes. It's kind of like their saviors. In this case, if you guys have heard of the Candy Bomber, that's the Candy Bomber, where he wouldn't just drop supplies, he'd also drop a ton of candy on little parachutes for the kids that they're always waiting for, kind of brighten their day. If you haven't ever heard about the Candy Bomber, I highly suggest looking that one up. Now, just pictures that go into this, just again, the Berlin Airlift, you see how bad Berlin looks. They definitely need supplies. People are clamoring for those supplies coming in, the massive amount of goods there. The picture in the upper right is showing all these planes just in and out. They even had to make a rule, kind of like they did in World War II during the Battle of Britain, that the pilots, if they were up more than 2 to 3 days at a time doing this, because a lot of these pilots were like, yeah, we want to save these people. They were forced to take a day of rest to go sleep and get their energy and their wits about them, because they didn't want to see these planes going down because someone blacks out due to lack of rest and sleep. But those pilots were, well, definitely heroes from our point of view, most definitely. So that saves West Germany, and so Stalin actually gives up. But then a big problem comes up in East Germany, and that is everybody starts realizing after a decade that East Germany sucks and West Germany is awesome, meaning in way of life. In East Germany, it's not a good way of life. The standard of living is low compared to West Germany. And you have a lot of people saying that. It's like, I live in East Berlin. I walk to West Berlin. It just seems like life is a lot better there. In East Germany, go to West Germany, things just seem a lot better there. So the socialist and communist leaders of East Germany and the Soviet Union looked at this and said, we got to stop these people from fleeing. Like, one of the more famous pictures of the time is this, where even one of the guards is like, I'm out of here. He just jumps over into the west side. So in the middle of the night, they decide to build the Berlin Wall. It was just a ragtag makeshift wall in the beginning. It was actually fairly easy to get through, and people did get through it. They just like ram a car or a truck into it or something like that. But for the most part, it went over without too much of a hitch. It didn't start World War III, although people thought it would. But it just kind of kept everybody on the east side on the east and everybody on the west side on the west. And no longer could anybody walk from East Berlin into West Berlin, get on a plane and fly to like Paris or New York and just get out of there. Get to the west, or get to even just Hamburg, West Germany, something like that. So, they were just kind of stopping all these people from going from east to west. Now, from our point of view, that's definitely an anti-freedom thing to do. But from the idea, from a socialistic, needs of the many against the needs of the few type thing, this just needs to be done. People just need to understand you just have to make it work. Anybody that leaves is a traitor. So that was the viewpoint. So the wall went up, and the wall stays for decades. Now, that initial wall wasn't very good, so they had to rebuild it later, and this is the later wall that they rebuild, where it's actually got a double line to it. There's landmines there, guard dogs, sniper towers. I don't think you see any sniper towers in that picture, but there's sniper towers. And anybody caught trying to get through that usually was killed. Even though there were still people that did try to get through that a bit. So, and there was a bunch of checkpoints where you could get through here and there, but man, they're heavily guarded. When I say heavily guarded, there were tanks there, heavily guarded from both sides. So, that's the idea of what happens in Germany. It stays that way until 1989. I'll talk about that later. So, I'm going to conclude this part of the lesson here, and we'll go into the next part about the nuclear race into the next one. So, I will catch you guys in the next part of this unit lesson.